Hello everyone, this is Robert Ranieri with the ABNS Executive Office, and I'd like to welcome you back to the Spring 2021 virtual conference. This presentation is entitled Secession Planning, CEO Transition and Continuity Plan. It is presented by Karen Plouse, the CEO of NBCRNA, Kevin Driscoll, the current president of NBCRNA, and Leah Cannon, the COO of NBCRNA. Now I'll turn it over to Karen to start the presentation.
Thank you for this opportunity to present on succession planning to the ABNS audience. We are excited to present some of the information that we have learned over the last years in planning the CEO transition and continuity plan. I am pleased to have our panel of presenters, and it includes Leah Cannon, who is our Chief Operating Officer, Dr. Kevin Driscoll, who is our current NBCRNA president, and myself, I'm the current CEO for the NBCRNA. I do want to point out at this point that our organization is using our president and chief operating officer to lead the succession planning, but other organizations may have different staff and or different board appointed to handle this transition, the succession planning, and other work related to this topic. Our topics today and our objectives will include to provide an overview of a CEO transition and continuity plan to promote smooth leadership transition. And although the focus of this presentation is on a CEO, it's very easily adaptable to other leadership positions within an organization. Say, for example, a chief operating officer, chief financial officer, a chief technology officer, or even a chief credentialing officer. In addition, we will provide some key resources to guide succession planning towards the end of the presentation. The mission of the NBCRNA is to promote patient safety through credentialing programs that support lifelong learning. Currently, the NBCRNA has an initial certification and continued professional certification program. We also have established a non-surgical pain specialty certification for CRNAs. There are over 55,000 CRNAs in the United States, and they practice in a wide variety of areas, including hospitals, independent rural clinics, independent outpatient settings, and are the primary providers of anesthesia in the U.S. Armed Forces. The topics that we will cover today are: what are the key points or components of a transition and continuity plan? There are four situations in which the transition and continuity plan may be adopted and may be included in your policy or procedure. And they include, first and foremost, a short-term or long-term leave of absence, death, sudden death of a CEO or chief officer, involuntary termination due to an unfortunate event, or voluntary departure. And today we will be focusing on the voluntary departure of a CEO. In addition, we'll go over some highlights of the timeline. And at this point in time, I will turn it over to Dr. Kevin Driscoll, who will continue the presentation. Dr. Driscoll.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Plouse. Thank you for inviting us to give this talk. I think that this is an item that is probably of utmost importance to the board of directors, because the board of directors really only has one employee, and that employee is the CEO. And when we talk about the governance structure, this is probably one of the most mission critical aspects to ensure that continuity of the organization happens. And sometimes the talk or discussion of a continuity plan causes angst among staff as well as board members. Sort of a taboo topic, but actually, if everyone has the benevolence of the organization in focus, it always should be talked about and discussed, and it should be an open dialogue. The transition and continuity plan, or what we call the TCP, is really utilized for unplanned as well as planned vacancies, or in the event of a temporary short-term or long-term leave. That can be a result from if your CEO is in the military, been deployed, or if there's a medical emergency or a health emergency or family emergency that they're going to be using FMLA to step away from their role. At our organization, a big component of our transition and continuity plan is the utilization of our COO. We're very fortunate as an organization to have a tremendously high functioning CEO in Leah, and we worked closely as a board to ensure that our transition and continuity plan carries over into our search and right on down the line. A critical component when you're talking about risk management and processes for your organization is to have a transition continuity plan, again, like I said, for leadership organizational structure. But again, from the board standpoint, where your only two responsibilities are fiduciary and governance, from a governance standpoint, the transition and continuity plan should always be looked at. The CEO is ultimately responsible for the plan because they handle all of our policies and procedures. However, the CEO is responsible for when they're onboarding and indoctrinating new board members to our culture, that this plan has gone over, that everyone understands where this plan is at and how it would be implemented in the various scenarios. It is also their role to review it on a regular basis and make recommendations to the executive committee regarding potential for changes. On a board level review, this should be done annually by the executive committee. And sort of the best timing for that is whenever you're having your CEO evaluation, it's a good time to have an open and honest dialogue about the plans for the CEO, a plan for retirement, plans for the future, so that we can ensure that the transition and continuity plan is always updated for the current events, that it's looking into the future. Some things that we have seen, especially this past year with the pandemic, you see how black swan events can change your thinking about how your policies and procedures are operationalized. And so again, these major events in an organization or in a society are great times to relook at your transition and continuity plan. If there's a lot of substantial changes to the transition and continuity plan, again, the board speaks as one voice, and the board ultimately owns that transition and continuity plan since the CEO is their only employee. And so that should really go to a board vote. Now, as I mentioned before, then whenever any board member gets onboarded, they're exposed to the transition continuity plan, so there's no ambiguity of what would happen. In addition, whenever we have since all the board members don't sit on our executive committee, there should be touch points throughout the time on the board that we should reevaluate the transition and continuity plan, even if it's not updated, so everyone is kept up to date with the plan. Next slide, please. There are several scenarios that are covered in a transition and continuity plan. They range from a leave of absence, death, involuntary termination, as well as a voluntary departure. Again, as Dr. Plausen mentioned, we're going to focus on the voluntary departure. That's sort of where we're at as an organization. It's sort of the best case scenario. It gives you time and leverage to maximize and communicate effectively throughout that transition. And your transition and continuity plan sometimes is more geared towards that. We like planned events in life. Unplanned events are sometimes hard to deal with, and that's why you have that transition and continuity plan. In the event of a leave of absence, which is short-term, less than 3 months, it's always good to have someone designated to be an interim CEO. In our organization, we've utilized our COO, Leah Cannon, who would actually fill in that role. It is also why we've reached out to Leah, and Leah and myself are co-chairing a CEO search, is because we have the aspects of operation as well as the board governance so that we can ensure communication is going up and down our silos. In the event of an unplanned death, the president would be the point of contact and the voice for the organization. They would also function as a communication link between the CEO to see if there's any more staff needed, that we would ramp up a search immediately, and that we would start to operationalize that transition and continuity plan. In addition, the president would be a critical link to the family of the CEO to express their condolences, as well as any organizations that we've interacted with our stakeholders. In involuntary termination, when we talk about involuntary termination, this could be for reasons of not renewing a contract, for ethics violations. In involuntary termination, the board president would actually be the communication link between the outgoing CEO. The COO would step in an interim basis. And again, we would be activating a transition and continuity plan, much like we would do in a death. However, we would ensure that the president and the CEO sort of tie up loose ends as in that process while in the departure. In a voluntary departure, it's actually sort of the best case scenario. And the reason is you have time to plan, a time to implement a plan, and also a time to think and be very prescriptive about how you're approaching that plan. Usually it's, you're talking about a timeline of anywhere from 6 to 9 months to stand up a search committee, and as well as find a search firm if you're going to be utilizing a search firm. In a voluntary departure, this is why it's always good to have communication during your yearly annual evaluations between the executive committee and your CEO to understand their plans, so that even though we say a timeline of 9 months, that the board can already start prepping for some of the groundwork to make sure that it's laid out seamlessly. Thank you. Again, in a planned departure, the timeline would sort of mirror an image like this, that there would be an announcement of the retirement that's 6 to 9 months out. First announcement, you need to be cognizant of who you're announcing it to. You don't want to just be announced to the general audience, but you wanted to pay respect first to not only your staff, but also key stakeholders to know that this is coming. After the key stakeholders, then there can be a general announcement. In a transition and continuity plan, we also have pre-packaged press releases. And this is sort of nice. So when you're trying to operationalize something in with an involuntary leave or an unplanned departure, then you have these things already in these communication streams in the background that you can just operationalize. When you stand up a search committee, you need to be thoughtful about who is on your search committee, what stakeholders do they represent. Whenever we look at it as an organization, we wanted to have the past, the present, and the future, as well as an external view of our organization, someone that utilizes our offerings and would have probably a different opinion of what is needed. When you're conducting a search, it could take 3 to 4 months. Have a call for applicants. After the call for applicants, usually having a whittling down process between a search firm. After that, your CEO search committee would then interview those candidates. And then the decision will be either made by your organization to either bring one candidate to the board or bring 2 candidates to the board. In our case, we were thinking about having the board actually talk about interview the final candidates. Whenever you're talking about onboarding, the CEO is a critical aspect of onboarding. And this should be at least 4 weeks. In your transition and continuity plan, you do have a segment in there for the input from the CEO to always have a SWOT analysis of the environment that you're operating in, to have a contact list of key stakeholders, as well as any critical documents and policies and procedures to make sure that they're up to date. CEO departure usually comes a little bit after it. After a CEO has been onboarded, the departing CEO is mainly there to answer questions. They're not there to operationalize anything else. It's actually a time to allow the new CEO to start making decisions, to have the departing CEO as a resource, and also to provide executive coaching for the new CEO. Next slide, please. In the transition continuity plan, in each of the situations that we had previously described, there are really common procedures that should be followed. Number one, the president and CEO coordination of their activities, whether it be for the search firm or operationalizing organizational carry through. Again, in our organization, we chose our CEO. We rely on our CEO very heavily. And that's why it makes sense to have the finger on the pulse of the staff, what concerns they may have, so that communications can be brought onto the staff, as well as the president can communicate to the board of directors and talk about their concerns or their priorities moving forward. That there should be frequent notifications and communications with staff. That staff should understand a picture, a plan, and that plan should be articulated frequently so they know where we're at in the plan. And then also provide a generalized vision of where we're going. Whenever you're communicating with staff, a lot of times people have a sense of fear or urgency that there's going to be a lot of change. And so we need to provide at least some stability to the organization to realize that, to reassure to the staff that change and transition is a normal occurrence. However, although it's a normal occurrence, that we have to be receptive to that change and transition and allow the new person to make decisions which are in the best interest of the organization. Usually after a new CEO comes on board, you want to have about 90 days before you even think about even strategic planning, because you want them to have the assessment of the culture as well as the lay of the land, so then they can communicate with and develop a strategic plan moving forward. Whenever you're coming in, the board should draft several resolutions, actually to empower the interim CEO, including authority as well as responsibility, reporting obligations, and a really finite list of who needs to know, who should be informed of decisions, and who needs to be included on decision making. Next slide, please. Communication with the staff should actually happen on both levels. On the staff level, from the CEO, they should be communicating with staff, sort of a general process of where we're at in the process. However, the president should also be engaged in that communication. Since they're the voice of the organization, they also take ultimate responsibility for any change in transition management. There should be frequent updates during the transition process. So communication at the beginning that we're initiating a search, a communication whenever you're starting to interview so they understand the timeline, that after the timeline, what will be happening next, that there is an orientation. And sometimes infographics are great ways that as you're updating staff, that you can just show them an infographic so they know where they are on a visual timeline. That we should be providing reassurances that the current CEO departure during and after the transition, that there will be a continuous and strong organizational presence, that there is invested interest by both the board as well as operations to ensure the success of that, and that the staff should embrace those changes. But we should also allay the fears of big reorganizations. This is not the time of Jack Welch or Neutron Drac, where you blow up an organization, just leave the foundation. But people really want to feel secure in their job. They want to provide input on potential ways that may be better to do their job, and that the board as well as the staff need to be open to those suggestions. When we communicate to key audiences, there's several people that you want to think about communicating. Number one, the retirement announcement. How do you time the retirement announcement? So sometimes it's better coming right from the CEO that they make that plan, they're going to retire. That's communicated in a press release. Then allow some time before you announce a CEO search to let the CEO have that moment of celebration and also celebration of all the work that they've done for the organization. When you talk about communications with key audiences in death, sudden removal, or an involuntary resignation, our transition and continuity plan have general outlines of how would you address these, as well as sample offerings of press releases. In addition to the sample offerings of press releases, we also have a sample offering of a search, as well as an interim CEO press release, and also a new CEO announcement. These transition continuity plans, although a little bit generic when you're talking about press releases, they do provide options to fill in the gaps to personalize that message moving forward. Next slide, please. The role of the board president, it's actually oversight and authority. Since the board president, the board speaks with one voice, the board president really needs to ensure that the process is respected, that the process has integrity, and the process is very transparent. The board president also acts as liaison with the COO, who may be acting as a CEO at the time if there's an unplanned departure, as well as with board and staff. That there needs to be communication with all staff, but also with senior leadership. So senior leadership understands where we're heading as a board. And there should be weekly calls with the CEO to update them on where we are in general terms with the search, as well as any outstanding work that needs to be done that may need to be transitioned over to the new CEO that may have longevity beyond their retirement. And also to provide frequent updates to boards. We use our board conference call. At the end of our board conference call, we have a board presence where we talk about where we're at in the committee search. Whenever you have committees doing work, you have to respect the work of the committees, that you entrust them, you embolden them with the work that they're doing. And so whenever they bring recommendations, we shouldn't be going back to the drawing board and re-looking at every aspect of how they came to that recommendation, that they did it with a lot of foresight and a lot of data points to make those decisions. So next, I'd like to transition to our CEO, Leah Cannon, to continue on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Driscoll. I appreciate that. So talking about the role of the Chief Operating Officer, our transition and continuity plan designates that the Chief Operating Officer serve as the liaison between the search committee, the staff, and the executive search firm. In our organization, as the Chief Operating Officer, I oversee human resources, so this fits right in. Your organization may have a different leadership position that would serve in this role. Our transition and continuity plan, as Kevin previously mentioned, also designates that the Chief Operating Officer may fill in on an interim basis at the board's request if there's a short-term vacancy in the position. As Kevin mentioned, this includes leave of absence, death, or involuntary departure. In the process, the Chief Operating Officer would also coordinate and request for proposal if needed for search firms, negotiate a contract with the search firm, and make sure all contractual obligations are being met. Next slide. The role of the CEO the current CEO is to provide information to the staff regarding the search process. This includes communicating the potential of the vacancy and sharing any anticipated timelines. Hopefully, the Chief Operating Officer has had continued conversations with the board or exec committee regarding their retirement plans. As the Chief Executive Officer is transitioning out of their role, they need to complete any outstanding projects and work responsibilities, including transitioning these projects to senior leadership if appropriate. The CEO needs to carve out the orientation plan for the new CEO, including establishing an onboarding plan with the senior leadership and staff. It is important that the vacating CEO supports the board's decision for the new CEO and helps to ensure a smooth transition. This will help with staff accepting the change. First, the organization needs to determine if they will use a search firm or perform the search with internal resources. We thought a search firm provides assurances that the process is open and transparent and gives opportunities for all that are interested to apply for the position. However, as an organization, you may feel that you can perform the search with internal resources and may elect to do your search on your own. Keep in mind that the search committee should be charged with helping to find the right candidate for the organization. Next slide. The CEO's search committee will be selecting the board's most important future employee. This is usually the board's only employee, so it's critical that they get it right. The search committee needs to be small enough to be nimble, large enough to be effective, but not so large that it's inefficient. We identified 6 people to serve on the committee, plus the staff representative. The committee will need to meet frequently during a short period of time, and scheduling is always a challenge. A smaller committee helps to make that process easier. The committee needs a unified understanding and agreement of the traits needed in the new CEO. Our search firm interviewed current board members to get their desired traits in a new CEO. This helped to perform the job description for the position and set guidelines for evaluating the candidates as the search committee moved forward. The search committee definitely needs to respect the confidentiality of the process. Candidates may not want it known that they are applying for the position. Next slide. An effective committee should have representation from all aspects of the profession. And Kevin shared some of this, but this can include experienced professionals, newer professionals to the industry, former board members, and a former president is always great to have on the committee. Current board members, as they have the best understanding of the current needs and of the organization and kind of what's going on. And a staff representative is always helpful too. Kevin assembled a great search committee using these guidelines. As the staff representative, I have been impressed with the discussions of the committee regarding the candidates and the overall process. Next slide. If the use of a search firm is selected by the board, the search committee should be given the opportunity to interview and select the firm they are most comfortable with. They will be spending a lot of time working with this firm, and it's helpful that they have a great working relationship. It's helpful if the organization also already has a list of potential firms to keep the process moving forward. If the organization wants to do an RFP, the process should start with the RFP to help identify the firm to be used. The committee will select a search firm, and as the chief operating officer, I worked with the firm to get the contract finalized. The next step was to open the application period. We had our application period open for approximately 8 weeks. During this time, we had people that submitted their application, in addition to the search firm soliciting recommendations from the board members and reaching out to these candidates to see if they're interested in applying for the job. Once the application period closes, the search committee gets very busy evaluating the candidates and whittling the list down. They make their decisions based on the job requirements that were determined earlier. Our process included reviewing the applicants and determining who met the qualifications. And then the next step is actually interviewing the shorter list of candidates to see who will move forward in the process. The search committee will then recommend a candidate or candidates to the board, and the board has the ultimate decision as to who they hire. During COVID, this process is a little different because all interviews will be done virtually. So it is a kind of a change in the process. We'll see how that ends up working out. Next up is onboarding, orientation. After the new chief executive officer is selected, contract negotiations need to happen. It's helpful if the organization has worked with their legal to already develop a draft of a contract that they can present to keep the process moving forward. Next, the onboarding process needs to be developed to bring the new CEO up to speed on the organization. This needs to first include an understanding of the current culture of the organization. The culture sometimes can change with the shift to a new CEO. Our current CEO, Dr. Karen Plouse, bakes staff a cake for their birthday, and I do not anticipate that we will find another CEO with her excellent baking skills. The new CEO needs to get an understanding of staff and staff roles, responsibilities. As a smaller organization, we have about 30 employees. Our new CEO will have the opportunity to meet and get to know all of our staff. The new CEO needs a good understanding of the governance structure of the organization. And this goes beyond what's on paper, but just really understanding the ins and outs of how the organization works and how the board relationship works. The new CEO needs a good understanding of the key external relationships and who the contacts are. The current CEO hopefully will have the opportunity to introduce the new CEO to many of these current or these key relationships and key contacts in the industry. The new CEO needs updates on current programs and any concerns with these programs. They need a great overview of the financial situation of the organization. Obviously operations, the day-to-day operations, how the programs work, how the staff relationships work, And they also need an understanding of the challenges of the organization and any concerns that this current CEO has on the programs and on the future of the organization. Next slide. Managing the exit. Lastly, the Chief Operating Officer needs to tie up any loose ends with the current CEO, make sure that all their contract obligations are being met, and make sure all legal requirements are checked off. The current CEO may have the opportunity to stay on an advisory role if requested by the organization to help the new CEO transition into their position. And now I will turn it back over to Dr. Karen Plouse to discuss the CEO input. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And I would like to echo what Dr. Driscoll has said. NBCRNA is certainly where we are today because of the caliber of Leah Cannon. She has really helped transition our organization over the last year since she started with the organization in 2012. And most important, working with Dr. Driscoll in really presenting this as a team approach and knowing who all the key players are. So what is this current CEO input? As Dr. Driscoll identified, early on in the process, the CEO is asked to provide input, and there are several questions that they're asked. For example, ranking what are the most difficult and strategically important items that the upcoming CEO will need to face. All of us today know that this primarily, for example, returning to the office in light of the pandemic and COVID. We're all very concerned about the safety of our staff and volunteers, and more importantly, want to adhere to the best practices of the CDC office guidelines in understanding individual variances. Another one is, what are the business scenarios that keep you up at night? I will have to say that as CEO right now, we have an exceptional leadership team. And so opportunities or scenarios that could keep you up are related, say, for example, to intellectual property, loss of an item bank, not being able to provide an initial certification, those kinds of things that you do want to be aware of. Another one is to identify any skill gaps between your current staff and what would be needed to meet those business scenarios. An opportunity is to provide input into the onboarding and orientation for a successor, and I know that this has been discussed. And one of the important considerations, it's really to help the new CEO understand the culture of the organization. What is the culture of the board? What is the culture of the staff? And what is the culture that we would like to see continue on? As Dr. Driscoll alluded to earlier, one of the assurances we want to provide the staff is that there will not be some big transformation or reorganization of the staff. And so it's really to promote a positive understanding culture that this is a change. Another one is to prepare a current environmental scan. And the environmental scan does include the strengths and weaknesses of internal factors. I will say that our strength as being the leader in nurse anesthesia credentialing and also nursing credentialing, but more importantly, one of our greatest strengths is our staff, and they do work all very well together, and I would say that this is one of the greatest strengths. In addition, the external factors, what are some of the opportunities? All of us are well aware today over the last year, the influence of social factors, the influence of diversity, equity, and inclusion that needs to be brought into our organizations. And then, of course, any threats. A good example of a threat is always the ongoing security threats related to your network if you do not have good systems in place. In addition, identify how organizations are responding to the current environment. Again, most likely this is related to COVID at this present time. And then anything that needs to be done to retain key staff in a transition. In building the plan and in looking at resources that are available for developing a CEO succession plan, there are several key resources. First and foremost, ASAE has the Guide to Succession Planning, and Gary LaBranche has put this book together, is most recently published in 2018. And in the back, there is a thumb drive that provides templates of many of the different pieces of a plan that you need. Board Source is another great resource that has a CEO transition. Also, Harvard Business Review has many key articles that can be a resource for you. In summary, I do want to point out, as has been alluded to, the process in creating a succession plan does involve change and transition. And this does involve the change and transition for the staff, for the board, and also your external stakeholders. Recently, Dr. Bridges, we have gone over what are the steps in transition, and it includes providing a clear purpose, creating the clear picture or the outcomes, identifying what the plan is, and then most importantly, identifying what is the part that each person has in the plan. We want to assure business continuity, and along this line, we always make sure that we have our standard operating procedures up to date and in place in case there is a sudden departure of a key person, following best practices for recruitment, retention, not only of staff, but also for the CEO. And then promoting respect and fair treatment for all involved. And this is a key factor to assure that there are no feelings of individuals being left behind or not involved in the situation. So for additional information, please feel free to reach out to Leah. Her email is noted up there. Our MBCRNA website has a wealth of information about the MBCRNA. And again, I would like to thank Dr. Driscoll and Leah for participating in this, and also thank ABNS for the opportunity to help provide this important information. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen and Kevin and Leah. I really appreciate it. An excellent presentation. I have to say, I was listening and I wrote down a few questions that I wanted to ask. And as I was writing them, you answered them as part of your presentation. So excellent work. But if it's okay, I would like to ask a couple if you have a few minutes here. One thing that jumped out to me that Kevin had mentioned earlier in the presentation was that the board has only one staff member, that being the CEO. Do you have a policy, if you will? Obviously, there's other staff members at the NBCRNA. How involved typically is the board with the other staff members? Is there a policy for that? Did you notice it changing during a transition? And what do you recommend that change be? Should there be a change? Who else do you find yourselves working with at that time? Was it different? Just kind of comment on that, if you could.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. So the board does have one person that they evaluate, and that is the CEO that they do on an annual basis. Mm-hmm. However, the executive committee, which in our organization is the president, the vice president, and secretary treasurer, have sort of bi-weekly meetings with the senior leadership to include our chief operations officer, our chief credentialing officer, our chief communications director, as well as our chief research officer. So the board has a communication link on a bi-weekly basis with those staff members so that we can ensure that the thoughts of the board are carried out operationally, that we're all on the same page, and also to address anything that arise on an in between general board meetings. It provides the opportunity for feedback too from the staff of any concerns or stuff that have sort of bubbled up that needs to come up to the board level as we plan agendas in the future. But from a standpoint of how we function, we believe that the board should stay focused on the larger picture, and that we allow operations to really get down the weeds. And so one problem that you can have on boards is that where you have boards that micromanage operations. And so what we try to do is we try to point that out to board members when we're starting to get down in the weeds and say, now, are we too far down in the weeds? Do we need to pull back up for a moment, take a breather, and let's just table that over to operations? And so that's how we sort of plan it. But Leah or Karen, if you would like to add anything.
Do you know, Robert, I would like to add that as CEO, as the current CEO, as we go through this process, I have invited our leadership team to provide input on these key areas that I talked about. What are environmental factors, the SWOT analysis of what's going on at the NBCRNA, input into the orientation, what's important for the new CEO to know from them. And so involving them along each step of the way, to me, is another way to assure that there is that continuity, that it's just not the CEO and the president, but that they all have a part in this.
Okay, very good. Thank you. You had also addressed the composition of the search committee, and I think you addressed it fairly specifically, but you said you had 5 to 6 members, and I was curious how many of those individuals were on the board currently, and I wondered if you wouldn't just mind sharing what it was about those individuals and any individuals that were on the committee that were not on the board. What stood out to you as the key factor for adding them or inviting them to be on that committee?
So our committee currently has 3 sitting board members on it. And I think it's important to have these 3 sitting board members because, they're in the know of what's going on with the organization and, what the organization needs moving forward. We also have a former president who used to sit on the board, obviously, but is no longer on the board. And, he brings a great historical perspective of the organization. We have a younger professional who kind of brings representation of the up and coming generations of CRNAs. And then we also have a program director who is someone that would use our programs on a continual basis and understands from kind of a consumer almost standpoint, what our organization provides and brings that perspective to it. So, again, as is the staff representative on the committee, I just think Kevin really put together an excellent group of representatives to handle the search. Does that answer your question? Go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead. No, I also wanted to add that one of the other, as a board member, Dr. Driscoll included our public member on the search committee. And Kevin, maybe you can talk about the reason you felt it was important to add.
Yeah, and thank you, Karen, because I was going to mention that is that I think Leah would like to give me credit, but actually it was communication with Leah. So when we're forming this group, we were looking for people with just a high level of emotional intelligence, with self-awareness of what we were looking for, that they can separate other aspects of their life to engage in this conversation, because it's a tremendous time commitment. But really, the first person that we sat on on the committee was our public member, and the reason is that our mission is to serve the public, and so they represent the first stakeholder, the voice that really why we're here. And so, if you look back on your mission and of your organization, whatever your mission says, that person should be the first one seated on your search committee.
Okay, very good. I've 2 more questions, if you guys don't mind. You had mentioned okay, so here's the next question. Have you noticed any changes in, NBCRNA has certificates, have you noticed a change in any metrics, if you will, during the transition period? Do you think that your certificates got nervous and said, I'm not doing this anymore, they don't, how did you address those types of issues with your certificates as far as, I guess my question is how you had mentioned about addressing the search with your key audiences. How did you address all these issues with your certificants specifically to ensure them that, you know, their certification was going to remain viable and valid and not become less significant.
Kevin, you want to handle that?
Yeah, sure. We already had pre-planned communications in our transition continuity plan. And one of them is to assure the people that the credential that they have, we wanted to ensure that's saleable wherever they're at, whatever state they're in. And so we celebrate the CEO succession not as a moment of fear, but as a moment of celebration of someone that's leaving, as well as an opportunity for new ideas to come into the organization. And I will say that from we've had regular communications with our certificants, because our requirements for our CEO search, they have to be a CRNA. So our audience that we're reaching out to are our certificants to apply. And so out of that 57,000, we had regular communication saying that here's a search, the search firm will be named, the search firm then communicated with those people, the search firm talked with key stakeholders and board members and even received feedback. We had people that applied of their own volition. And then we had the search firm actually actively pursue people, which are two different audiences of applicants. And so they actively pursued people that people said, you know what, this person would make a great CEO. And so to engage them in the conversation, because some people won't apply unless they, or never really thought to apply, unless they're engaged by a search firm. And so again, we had a robust response. We've been extremely pleased with the candidates that we received. And we feel that right now that we're all talking to very high level people, that any one of them can run the organization and run it well.
Do you know, and one other point along to make, Robert, is our certification and continued certification is a requirement for nurse anesthesia practice. And so therefore the certificates will continue to come to the MBCRNA as the sole provider of a credential for advanced practice nurses in this category.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that stood out to me, because I was, and you know, I would like to know what some of the other more voluntary certificants have experienced. Would be a good discussion point, I guess you could say, to see if they did see a change in their metrics for concern of there being a transition. But I would say that to follow the process like you did and like you outlined here would probably belay those types of changes in metrics, I would expect. So I think you've done a real good service for the other certifying boards, because this is going to be a really good policy, if you will, or plan to follow. So I think this has just been really an excellent presentation. I think it's going to help a lot of the other certification boards should they experience something like this. So I want to thank you again for putting this presentation together and making it available to the certification boards. It's going to be a real help for them. Thank you.
Thank you.